Yes. Alright, start of the commentary.
Hey, I'm
Oh,
Jake Keeley here in Boston to go behind the scenes to hear some untold stories about the making of Bioshock with Ken Levine and Sean Robertson. Let's talk a bit about the theme and setting of Bioshock, Rapture. I think a lot of people, when they played the game for the first time, Ken, they wondered, how did you even dream up this place? And I know you said publicly before that part of the reason you sort of what led you to Rapture was this idea of fully simulating a place. Tell us about that sort of idea and the frustrations you had with other games where you sort of hit a bound.
I think our philosophy was always to do what we were doing 100% rather than try to do something bigger and do it 50% or 40%. So one of the ideas of, and this sort of came from System Shock 2 as well, where you focus on an area that you can really bring to life and you kind of eliminate the questions of, well, why can't I go over the bridge to New Jersey? So we were able to really make a place, I think, that felt believable and real, even though in actuality it was really quite limited. But we just sort of dressed it with all these buildings outside that were all, they were all basically glorified fakes. We let the story drive what we needed to show rather than some kind of like predetermined map which we set down, which is a little different than like System Shock 2, where we actually mapped a spaceship out deck by deck.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what the philosophy felt a little different there, because you want to feel like a real spaceship that was sort of stacked on top of each other. Rapture was free to sprawl across the ocean floor.
Although you guys originally, Sean, were talking about doing this game on a sort of spaceship again, right?
Yeah, when we first started talking about what the spiritual successor to System Shock 2 was going to be, spaceship came up, but again, we wanted a limited environment. We didn't necessarily want to do spaceship again. And our first actual exploration of the space was underwater, but ultimately ended up looking like a spaceship. It just happened to have a couple of seaweed fronds outside, and that started to push us towards what artistic statement that we wanted to make this look different, and what rules we were going to set for the world. How at every turn we were going to try to remind the player that they were in fact underwater and that this wasn't a spaceship.
And how, like, underwater, we obviously know you did underwater, then sitting in the sky, like, where did you come with the idea of, like, doing this underwater?
I think there was probably a conversation. It's like, well, what kind of places could be cut off from other places?
Yeah.
Like, well, spaceship, summer camp, any island notion, right? Something that's cut off from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So you never felt like you should be able to go over that bridge to New Jersey.
I don't want to apply some deep and meaningful conversation. I think it was one of those ideas that you just kind of say, and then everybody, that sounds cool. Let's try that. Let's go for it.
And I think it lended itself to having very nice views out the window without having to build an insane amount of unique assets.
Right.
By today's standards, we still were a small team back then, and there's an expectation that because you're underwater, the view distances are going to be short, so you can really kind of fade out into the fog at a short distance and not have the expectation that, why can't I see forever? So there's a lot of limitations in a good way that we put on ourselves by being underwater, as opposed to, like, if you're on a cruise ship, then you'd expect to see across the water and we'd have to deal with that. Same thing with an island.
Or
and
in
you
a
have
city in the sky.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was a lot more complicated.
Yeah. So you came up with the idea of, let's do this underwater, let's do this sort of isolated place. Then you had to answer the question of, why would someone build this? Is that sort of how it worked, sort of order of operations? You then had to come up with a story to explain?
Yeah, I think we wanted a very believable reason why they'd be there, and sort of the necessary isolation of the place sort of led to, well, what kind of person we want to do this. And I wasn't even particularly aware of the sort of political implications of what I was reading, but I've been reading, I had read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and I mostly thought it was an interesting story. Like, I didn't realize that people were sort of basing their sort of political lives around it.
Objectivism.
I wasn't that tuned in to that stuff at that point.
Atlas Shrugged is the other one,
I love
I think.
the dialogue and the kind of speechifying in it, because you can see a video game character speaking with that kind of certainty and that kind of confident philosophy. It just seemed like a natural kind of thing to apply to this place, and so it just sort of all came together as a sort of a who is the guy who would do this? Well,
Right.
you know, that character. He was sort of this amalgamation of characters from Ayn Rand's books and Ayn Rand herself. This sort of idealistic person who says, well, the only way to do this is to separate from the rest of the world. And that led to Andrew Ryan.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone.
We knew from a technical standpoint that we wanted isolation. We also knew to sell it, we needed a compelling storyline, a backstory that why would this place exist? Otherwise, how are we going to make Rapture feel like it's lived in if we don't have the reason for it to be there? So once we decided on the underwater location and then the closed off spaces, that objectivist story kind of came in and made the art stronger and made the level design stronger because we could feed back into that loop.
And I think that's why we had to have sort of Andrew Ryan's pitch right at the beginning of the game. We wanted people to understand why somebody would go there.
And really sets the
So
theme of
makes
it.
a very personal one-to-one pitch to the gamer, but also that was the pitch you make to people, which was, you know, there's a place that you can be free of all these things, where you can not be sort of put upon by the government and not be afraid of nuclear war and not be afraid of all these other things that will plague you on the surface. And we wanted that pitch to sort of resonate and make sense, because that's otherwise by the time you got there you'd be like, well, this place is just fantasy, nobody would ever come here. And that the beauty of the place also was also tied into that. It had to be a very attractive proposition, or people who would believe that people would go leave their lives and go to
That made me think of Silvermoon
I'm
there.
sure in some ways you had to convince the team
Golds
of
and
what
reds.
your sort of vision of, you know, who this character was going to be and what the setting was going to be. How did that work, Sean? I mean, Ken come in and say, hey, I've been reading these books, and I think we could sort of...
I believe he just came in one day on a horse and said, Ayn Rand, everybody read the Fountainhead.
Exactly. I bought 30 copies of
Yeah, I think, you know,
Here's a 2,000-page book or something.
Yeah.
Go read it.
I mean, really it was more organic. You know, like I said, we knew
Apparently
that we
Atlas
had this
Shrugged
location,
is 1,000.
and you struggle to fill it with stories, and you struggle to find meaning of why does this place exist, you know, what's my motivation. And as Ken started to explore Ayn Rand a little more and started talking to us about it, and we were having that conversation, and it's like, oh, this could totally work, like this is exciting, like this is something that really hasn't been done in a video game before. And if we had flipped it and come up with the idea first before the location, I don't think we would have really been that excited about it. But we had a location, and now we're trying to fill it with that story, and because of the order of operation there, you start to get excited, like, oh, I could totally make this work. This is going to really make it feel like a lived-in space.
You know, as you think of sort of the, you know, the setting, and you think of maybe a character or something, was there a moment that you think back, it's like, oh, like right then and there, like I got excited when you attached the Ayn
For
Rand
me,
stuff
it was
to
going to Rockefeller Center and seeing the visual.
Uh-huh.
So I told this story before, but my wife and I were in New York, and we went to Rockefeller Center, which was, if you go to Rockefeller Center, it basically looks exactly like Rapture. It's because every building, you're sort of encircled. It's this block in New York, or a couple of blocks in New York, where Radio City Music Hall is, and 30 Rockefeller Plazas, we used to see that show 30 Rock, and the ice skating rink, and where they put the Christmas tree, and it's this very iconic location. But what's cool about it, it's all one, unlike the rest of the city. Everywhere you look, it's one architectural style. It's Art Deco, and it's very iconic Art Deco. And my wife and I were there, and we were sort of working on the game. We didn't have a visual style, and all of a sudden I started looking around, and I said, oh, this could be a visual for the game. Also, the geometry of it was actually quite conducive to making a video game, because it wasn't overly complicated geometry. Art Deco is quite
Bold and simple.
bold and geometric, yeah, and simple. And so my wife and I bought a couple of tourist cameras before iPhone
Right,
cameras,
exactly.
you know.
throwaway cameras.
Yeah, throwaway cameras, those little Kodak things, and we just started photographing doorknobs and light fixtures, and sort of developed the photos. Remember that? And brought them in and said,
In the office, here's a stack of stuff.
here's a
Sean,
stack of
take a
photos.
look.
I'll see you guys in a couple of years. Go make this.
It is really nice to see like the devs talking about it. I'm a little impatient because I want to play the other thing, but It is nice to also see like their thing on it.
And with the sweat of your brow, rapture.
I know you might want to hear my commentary here, but you also feel awkward about just giving it raw to you, you know?
So you had kind of a theme, you came up with an art style, some of the iconic characters, and then you really had to build the narrative around it. And you talked about a lot of the themes in the game, and greed, jealousy, sex, violence, all the things that sort of drive us or what destroy us. And that was something I think that as you thought about the story of the game, you wanted to, I'm sure, reflect some of those, right? Because I think people love the characters, it's sort of flawed in a way, and this is a world which is its own little microcosm, but had a lot of tension inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, the character Ryan was sort of, he's basically invisible through most of the game, except for a very small portion. But he's very present because he exists, the city is him, right? It's such a representation of him. We never want to cut away to a cutscene where you saw Andrew Ryan, planning and scheming. We wanted him to be very present without actually being present. But once you had Ryan, once you had his desire to protect this vision of his, you just had to then come up with a character who'd be arrayed in opposition to him. So we had this character, the Big Daddy, and then eventually the character, the Little Sister, and so characters like Tenenbaum came along. Like, here's a person who's in opposition to him for this reason. And then you have, for more noble reasons, and then you have a character like Atlas, who's much more cynical opposition. Once we had all those characters arrayed, we're like, well, who are you? And you ended up being a sort of a pawn in the middle of all this opposition to Ryan. We just kept her homing in on that theme, making sure that you weren't, eventually figuring out that you couldn't just be here by an accident, that you were an integral part of this story, even though you don't know you're an integral part of this story. You think you're just there by happenstance.
Look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel.
The intro level is a pretty good way of, just like throwing all the elements of Rapture at you like straight away. Andrew Ryan, Atlas, the Splicers, the kind of horror side of it, the tension of the enemies, the Little Sisters, the Big Daddies, the devastation to Atlas, to the city. It's like, just thinking about it, it is actually a great little thing, Apparently, I also saw a video there. This is like an hour 16. Like all of these together. Presumably with little commentary in between. So I'm going to try and pick up the pace with these. As if I can.
Bioshock was groundbreaking in many regards when it released in 2007.
Oh.
Fundamentally, it shared many consistencies with the Rational System Shock series. What elements of System Shock
What's in
translated
Rationals?
into Bioshock, and what was refined, altered, and innovated upon to create the world of
Looking
Rapture?
Glass.
Let's take a look at the long road from System Shock to Bioshock.
Some of the devs came from Looking Glass, but it wasn't an irrational game. I noticed the flaw! Apologies, I'll try not to talk over it, but also there's him making a world, and remember hearing another thing in like Half-Life to fake
Everyone knows
alternate
where the game
paths
ended up,
to
but,
try and
I think
embellish it.
Fans would be interested to learn where this game or the idea of doing this game started. And I think folks know System Shock and the legacy of that game. Huge fan base. Did it start as a System Shock game initially?
No, I mean, 'cause
Okay.
we didn't have the
Right.
rights to that.
Yeah.
Right? We kind of felt that there was more game design to mine there. That it was sort of, we did that one game, and it was sort of the first game that really combined shooting and RPG, and it was a very small budget. It was a very small team, and it was the first game we had ever done. So we got pretty lucky, I think, in terms of how well it came out. But the odds were sort of stacked against it. And the team, was really enthusiastic about doing a game like that. And time had evolved, and the team was much more. We had done a bunch of games together, and we were, we had a stable technology base, and we were like, okay, well, which System Shock 2 was not. I mean, that engine, no game had ever shipped on that engine. It was a very crude piece of technology. Most of us had never shipped a game at the time. So like, well, what if we had a stable technology base, and we had a team that was more experienced and more seasoned, and we had, an actual, like, art director, and which we didn't really have on System Shock 2. What could we do? And so I think there was a lot of enthusiasm in the team to really try to do a more mature version of that kind of game.
Though they did go in a different direction with it in System Shock 2, they did like the stats system and whatnot, which they, Like you level your strength and all that.
This is before we had sold the company to Take-Two, and we were an independent developer, right? We were sitting there, we were using the money
I
we
think
made
that made
from
sense.
other development deals we had, and we would try to scrape together whatever time and money we had to work on this thing. And it was not actually something I was particularly keen on doing. The team was much more keen on doing sort of a System Shock-ish game than I was, because
That's your pitching, right? Like System Shock 3 at one point, right?
well, I mean, there was an actual System Shock
Right.
3 that we were pitching
Okay.
back in the day when we were right after System Shock 2, but that never happened. They couldn't get anybody interested with System Shock 2. Sold like 5 copies, right? And so, as the business guy, the guy who had to not only just sort of write the content, but the guy who had to go out and get the deals and pay everybody, I wasn't particularly excited about doing this, because it's very disappointing when you get System Shock 2 and nobody bought it. It got great reviews, it got these insane reviews, but it left us in a place where it didn't really move the needle for us in terms of making payroll. So I wasn't super excited about it, because I didn't see a publisher be interested in it, and I didn't see the audience actually be particularly interested in this kind of game. And it was really the team who convinced me to invest in this, because their enthusiasm. I think a lot of them came to the studio because of System Shock 2, and so finally they sort of battered me down, and it's good they did, because I was not the first fan of doing this.
And I know initially there was something called the Serene Dawn. That was a spaceship,
Name
or
of
what was
it.
that?
No, that was
It's the name of a cult, right?
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
That one's, I think, been lost to the. If I remember correctly, Serene Dawn was a cult. You were playing as a deprogrammer that was infiltrating the cult, and your name happened to be Carlos Coelho, who was one of our programmers at the time.
Which is named after him, yeah. Then there was a story notion that I always really found interesting, which was that you have these cults, and you have sometimes people who they're these sort of characters who are really live on the edge of the gray morality, which is these guys who come in and essentially kidnap people out of these cults or rescue them, depending on how you look at it. Because what it really is, from a functional standpoint, it's kidnapping, right? You're coming to an adult and you're saying, you're hired by their parents or whoever, and this was in the story, it was like a senator whose daughter joined one of these religious movements called the Serene Dawn, you said?
Yeah,
Serene Dawn. And I always thought that was a really interesting tension of this hero who's basically a kidnapper, and taking a young woman against her will out of the place that she was in. Now, you could also make the other argument that, well, she was not really there by her will. But there's a really interesting conversation that goes on there. I think there was actually a Kate Winslet movie, a Harvey Keitel Kate Winslet movie, which dealt with a similar theme. Because usually you hear that story, these deprogrammers as a sort of heroic kind of notion, but I always thought that there's something interesting about agency going on there, about are people entitled to make bad mistakes, or is it a bad mistake? It all depends on the person. I'm not a fan of religious cults or religion in general, but there seems to be an interesting discussion of freedom there and independent decision making, and I thought that idea was cool, and that was sort of the basis of it for a while. But it was really mostly for the purpose of we needed something to go out and pitch to publishers, and so we didn't have a ton of time to really develop it. So that sounded like, all right, this will do for now.
And was that pre-Underwater City? I mean, this was just like an idea for a story.
We may have stepped away from that to do the cult thing, but then we went back to the underwater.
And we had that one room, remember?
We had the one World War II room with the roaches on the ground and like these weird test tube things that you could walk around. I don't know where that fell. It could have been underwater. There was no windows.
The thing is, we were a small business, right? And we were trying to figure out a way to sell this thing with spending the least amount of money, because we didn't have any money. We didn't have a pocket percent. So we would do this demo. That was one room basically, just to show. And I'd write up a document, and we'd take it around. I'd fly around the country, be like, "Here's our room." It was a different time, And
we had just come off of SWAT 4. One of the advantages we had is that we were so familiar with that engine at that point that we could really start cranking through, small rooms and lighting and making things look good. So
I took it on the road to sell it to somebody, and nobody cared. We'd go to a publisher, and look, they have to make money, right? And we'd say, oh, it's sort of a spiritual successor to System Shock 2, and they'd be like, well, how did that sell? And I was like, my mom likes it, and they would be like, well, we can't, and usually we'd be talking to a fan. A lot of executives, like sort of junior executives, were fans of System Shock, and they go to their boss and they'd be super excited, and their boss would open up, their Excel spreadsheet and be like, "No, we can't do this." And I think the pitch probably evolved as we kept trying different permutations trying to sell, but we were also out there trying to sell like 2 or 3 other things at the time. We had a pitch for a game called Monster Island, and
Yep. Well, our SWAT 5 pitch was...
Zombie SWAT.
Yeah, we just come off of SWAT 4, which is like hardcore tactical, and we decided they wanted us to do another SWAT, and we didn't really want to do another hardcore tactical game, so we're like, what if we added zombies to SWAT? Like,
And this
you're a
is
SWAT team that fights zombies and werewolves. That sounds awesome. It was like, no, it doesn't.
And this is before. This is
We're
like
not gonna do
before zombies were a thing.
Yeah.
And so we came up with this thing called Division 9.
Division 9, yeah.
That probably would have been even a bigger financial success than Bioshock.
Wow.
But we couldn't get anybody interested in it.
We didn't have enough werewolves in the game.
We had 0 werewolves in the demo. Yeah, we were gonna have werewolves, weren't we?
Werewolves and vampires. Those are
Oh,
the-
really?
Yeah,
Werewolves,
the whole,
vampires,
like,
zombies?
just
Okay,
throw it
okay,
all the Universal Studios monsters from like,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
So what happened was we couldn't sell it, but we were always sort of independent minded, and so I said, well, what if we sort of did this in reverse? Instead of getting a publisher first and then going to a press tour on it, what if we sort of did the press first? And we called up a guy, Andrew Park, who was at GameSpot at the time, who was a fan of System Shock 2 and a great guy. And I said, will you come out and look at this thing we're doing and write a story on it? And he's like, sure. And Andrew flew out and we showed him what we had, which is this very, very rudimentary thing about an underwater base. And he wrote up an article and sort of featured as that this is the spiritual successor to System Shock 2. And the next day, the phone started ringing from publishers who now all of a sudden saw that the article was getting all this pickup and all these comments and people were excited. And that really, I think, put it over the top in terms of being able to sell it, even though it was not Bioshock at that point. It was called Bioshock, but it was not Bioshock. There would have been I don't think there would have been a game. We never would have sold it without Andrew coming out doing that.
Yeah, like you see, you find Tenenbaum's cure for cancer. And the scarab thing we saw in the museum. We also saw one of the one of the concept arts there. We saw one of the beasties from the museum as well. The bulky guy, I think it was the Grenadier, or Stitches or whatever, Patches. He's are taking a bit, and I am rather anxious to get on to Bioshock 2. I kind of don't want to leave without seeing it all, but at the same time, I'm like, it's half one. Maybe I'll do this in stages like I'm doing with Witcher. Actually, I need to reinstall that and continue it. One more.
One of the biggest challenges Irrational faced when developing Bioshock was figuring out a way to retain the feeling of a deep RPG while making the game accessible to a broader console audience. Ultimately, the team succeeded in creating an intricate system of weapon and character upgrades that gave the player choice and customization while keeping the gameplay fast, lean, and engaging.
One of the hallmarks of Bioshock, to me at least, was that it really blended RPG and sort of first-person action game together in a way that, is sort of standard today, but a decade ago was really pretty revolutionary. And I know for the team, I think at some point it became clear that you wanted this to work on consoles, not on PC, right?
Oh, both, yeah.
Yeah. But so the idea of, doing a console game and a PC game, and doing something that sort of felt like a shooter but had much more depth. And I know in some of the early design docs you talked about sort of creating an FPS plus versus an RPG light. What was the difference in your mind between those two?
I think for us, is the big difference between System Shock and Bioshock ended up being that System Shock was more about your character growth and Bioshock was more about the environment. Because with System Shock, we really didn't have System Shock 2. We didn't really have either our team to make enough assets or the visual power to sort of make a really convincing environment. But as we started working on Bioshock, the art team was so strong that the ability to tell a story within the environment became the most important thing about the game. And that was sort of not something we thought right at the beginning. That was not really a concept we had. But as we started building things, we could realize that the visual world was the star of this thing. The Rapture was really the star of this thing. And telling the story outside of cutscenes, telling it in the world, so the gamer could have discovered the story rather than us telling him the story, telling him or her the story. And it was still very much for the time. I think for the time, quite different than what you had seen in terms of there wasn't a lot of growth in shooters. So
Right.
it was still, I think, for the time, very, very revolutionary. But I think System Shock 2 was even more ahead of its time in terms of that growth thing, because we defocused a little bit. Primarily, part of it was just figuring out how to do that all on a console controller was very tricky.
They never did explain why you saw those phantoms. That, yeah, but
So I
the
hear even the early demos, people like, you see a plasma, you see like a upgraded weapon, you're like, oh, I've never seen that before in a shooter. And that was, when you were coming out of the sort of, the Quake, Doom, Half-Life, where it's like you have, 8 weapons on the keyboard, and you sort of knew what they were, and they weren't going to change. Sean, was that something that, from a sort of creative standpoint, was it always clear that that was something you guys wanted to do, or it evolved over time because you wanted to have more depth in the game?
I mean, it certainly evolved over time, and each upgrade path was slightly had its own unique challenges. Like certainly upgrading the weapons, you had to design a base weapon that didn't feel like crap. Still felt like something that you wanted to use, but then the ability to add the upgrades to that, and each of the upgrades could come in any order, so you have to be aware that this parts A, B, and C could come in at any different time to upgrade the weapon. In a first-person shooter, that's your star. That's the thing that you're seeing all the time. When it comes to other things, plasmids, things that are,
Tonics.
tonics, yes, sorry. It's been a while.
Come on, Sean.
I know, it's 10 years. Those things were more offloaded to machines that you would then have to interact with, so you're not carrying the inventory around with you. But each of these decisions on how we're going to upgrade the player, it wasn't like a mouse and keyboard. Okay, we can just use the mouse, and you have all these buttons at your disposal.
You could arbitrarily point at a part of the screen really easily, which you could do in System Shock 2.
Yeah, so we certainly learned trial by fire when we were trying to adapt these things to the console at the time.
Yeah, and like having different ammo types and stuff like that. Like we went through numerous iterations of the interface to make it. Like we had the first times when we sort of put the interface into play.
oh,
It was very obtuse and very tricky to get your head around, and we just kept working on it and working on it and working on it because we want to feel like second nature. But that was we spent a lot of time on that.
that was the original Big Daddy. Well, like one of the original looks at correction. It was the old version of the bouncer. Yeah, old version of the bouncer. But that's cute.
What motivated the idea of having so much choice in the way you could sort of play through this game? What was it to give the player a better sense of authorship over the experience, or what was driving that?
I've always
Fits in
thought
with
that
Ryan's
games had
philosophy.
a lot of agency in terms of their play style and experimenting with the play style and trying different things and seeing what worked and didn't work and interacting with the environment. The notion that it's sort of a playground that you get to play around with and imprint your own desire on was great, because I think we were more skeptical about being able to do that with story at the time. Like so much to the point where that became almost like a joke. That becomes the meta joke of the game, how little agency you have in your story. But agency in terms of how you play the experience and how you load out your weapons and how you interact with the environment, as compared to most shooters at the time, where basically like you can shoot them with the shotgun or shoot them with the pistol. That was really important to us. So we spent a lot of time trying to make the game, the world, react in a way that you would expect and hope it to react when you tried something.
And some of those system or decisions we made about systems fed back into the narrative, like locking Adam behind Big Daddy and Little Sister. Like you can't get Adam unless you deal with the Big Daddy, which then becomes a roving boss fight, which then becomes another system that I don't know if we planned that from the start, or was one of those happy, like, serendipity, like, oh, this decision that we made about putting Adam behind the Big Daddy totally works, because now we have a different type of boss fight that you haven't really seen in other games.
Actually, it was the other way, because what happened was originally there was no concept of Adam, and Big Daddy just had money and other treasure on them, like every other splicer. Yeah. And they were so tough, nobody would ever fight them, because why on earth would you go after that guy?
Right, go off a bunch of small slicers and get the same amount. Yeah.
So we had to come up with a currency that was exclusive to them, because we knew that was where the fun was, right? But we also knew people were terrified of them, and we didn't want to fight them.
Yeah.
So video game development and system development is a lot like economics, right? In economics, you try to encourage certain behaviors through tax, usually through tax policy. Well, you want business growth, so you lower taxes on certain segments of the business economy, or you want to encourage people to move into this area, so you make incentives to move in here. We had to make an incentive for players to fight the Big Daddy, and Adam became that incentive. But then, once you had this Adam, then you had a new piece of narrative, which they could then incorporate back into the story.
Stay away from her, or it is you who will be shot next.
Easy now, Doctor. He's just looking for a wee bit of Adam. Just enough to get by.
I'll not have him hurt my little ones.
Talk a bit about the plasmids and the vending machines and that sort of whole approach to, I guess, what is kind of a tech tree, but and coming from PC games, used to strategy games and whatnot, with very complicated ways of how you would upgrade things. I thought you guys did you had a really interesting approach to how you made it very accessible to a console audience. How did that evolve? Did you know the vending machines were going to be there from the get-go?
We had vending machines in System Shock 2, so we were sort of lifting that, and I always thought that was a fun notion because it's a affordance that people already understand. They see a vending machine, they know immediately, oh, that's where I buy stuff, right?
Yeah.
And you also then have to have a shopkeep. When we talked about wanting to make things, put limitations on ourselves so things felt fully believable, we had a shopkeeper sitting there. You can't shoot him. He sits there. He doesn't say anything. And all of a sudden, he feels fake. Where a vending machine, the Circus of Values machine, could feel 100% authentic, despite the fact that it's selling like ammo and stuff like that, which is.
But in an objective society where you don't have rules and regulations on that type of thing, it feeds back into the narrative.
But you don't then break the fiction at all by having these characters who sort of don't really live and breathe in the world. So the vending machines became an important part of that, but we still want to give them character, and hence and so that clown image came from a piece of that image is actually from like a fruit container or something from like the 1940s.
Okay.
And so we had a book of like royalty-free images, and I saw that image and I'm like, let's put that clown on, and we'll call it Circus of Values. And then we wrote some lines for it, decided he'd be this sort of asshole clown, and then we hired the best actor in the world to play that part. That's me. What I cost my biggest Avengers, I didn't cost anything.
I didn't know you were really.
I was
a
surprised.
Yeah.
No, I was surprised.
Hear it in my head every week.
My wife hates that voice. She hates that voice.
You can give us a little of it right here.
Welcome to the Circus of Values. She does not allow me to do that, so I do it outside of the house.
Okay.
But it allowed us to have something that felt very rich and very real, while being very limited at the same time.
Feel your cravings at the Circus of Values.
And also, the plasmids and sort of the motif of sort of the videos and how you explain sort of what a plasmid was. That was a really fun way, I thought, to sort of explain that. Sean, how did you guys evolve that? Because it was very artistic approach.
I think those came on pretty late too, because we were developing all these systems, and you make the assumptions because you're dealing with them every day that the player who gets this game is going to understand what these systems are. And we always joke that you can't ship the developer of the game, or you can't expect somebody to have a README file for all of these things. Nobody's understanding what these plasmids are or how to use them. How do we present these to the audience in such a way that they're going to understand what it is fictionally and what it is functionally? It was Rob Waters did a lot of the animations on those, and we sit down and we write out like a little 30-second commercial of what this thing is. And again, because going back to the narrative, this is what would happen in Rapture. People are trying to sell these things, so they would come out with commercials to explain why you need this. Using that as your framework, you can then come up with all of these little gags that people will remember, that have a little personality to them. But I think ultimately in the end weren't that expensive to create, because they're cheap.
I think one of the most important things about it is we didn't want them to be long, and we didn't have a lot of budget for the arts. We have like a couple of frames of animation in them essentially. And so we had to figure out, how do we message how this thing works in like that, and that's what marketing is, right? It's how do you message how something works, and marketing and tutorializing are very similar things, right? You're trying to get a message across in a very brief period of time in a very snappy fashion. And I think that one of the things that I always felt about games is that tutorials are sort of death, and because they're usually like you go into a scene and there's like a shooting range or something like that, and
narratively they never really make sense either,
and they're so boring. And so we always try to put a big burden on ourselves of how do we train people while not letting them know they're being trained. And brevity is really important to that. So we had a bunch of art constraints in that, which also led to a bunch of writing constraints. And so those things were like, I don't even know if they were 30 seconds.
Yeah,
They
probably
were
more like
really
15
short.
seconds.
Yeah, 15 seconds long. We had to explain a whole plasmid in that period of time.
Yeah.
And I think that was a good exercise because it also made the game, it forced us to be concise and to really explain what this thing was like that.
It was some nice timing, they're talking about clicking, which timed up with the inmate one there. It's kind of cute. Alright, I'm gonna leave that here for now, and I'll pop back in at another stage and I'll record the rest of them. I'll just slice it together. So, see you then. Hey folks, back for a bit more developer commentary. I suppose you probably don't want my commentary in here, but damn it, you're getting it anyway. The Weevil's creative process next.
Nailing the perfect marriage of story to gameplay is a science that many developers still struggle with today. Bioshock has left an indelible mark on gaming narrative that can be seen and felt in many modern releases, but Irrational's motto remained from the beginning, don't start with the story, start with the gameplay. A lot of fans probably wonder about the process you go through in writing the story and the design for a game like Bioshock. You've talked about how it evolves over time and what eventually shifts is very different than your initial vision. Do you guys write like a script or a design document for the game and that becomes sort of the Bible that everyone drives towards, or do you iterate much more?
It's different for every game. Like System Shock 2, I went back to it recently. I wrote a design document, and we started that project in September, and the design document I saw was dated like October or something. So in a month, I wrote the design document, and it didn't change. A lot of it, got expanded upon, but the basic design really didn't change on that. Where on Bioshock, I think it evolved in real time much more. We had a pretty substantial design shift, like a year before the ship date.
For Bioshock?
Bioshock, yeah. It got to be much more about the experience of being in Rapture than about being in your character sheet. And so the game evolved more towards that experiential kind of thing and making sure every idea was expressed in the world as well as just on your character sheet. So before you'd have a lot of things like, oh, I'm doing fire damage or electrical damage, but that was sort of a number flying off ahead versus, the whole notion of there's barrels and you light them on fire and then you can pick them up and throw them.
But you'd have stats coming off characters and all that stuff?
Much more so.
Oh, really?
And that evolved, sort of, we did a design shift, but I don't know how well that got documented. I think we were moving so fast that we were just sort of changing things, laying down the tracks as we went right ahead of us. And the same with the screenplay, the screenplay there is no screenplay. It's a bunch of probably Excel files and fragments of Word documents that I'd write and I'd go to recording sessions and I'd rewrite on the fly once I hear the actor perform, because once the actor takes on it, you listen to their voice and you say, what you wrote doesn't really matter. What is the right thing for this actor playing this role to be saying? So I tend to do a lot of rewriting in the session, and then you have a bug late at night where somebody says, oh, this doesn't make any sense, and you're like, oh God, you have to write a new audio log and try to get the actor back in, or you figure out what's the best way to get this idea across. Yeah. And is it an audio log? Is it a poster on the wall? Is it a piece of text that pops up on the screen? That's always dependent on how much time you have and what actor availability is. So, the plans sort of fall apart. I think we've worked on that a bunch since on the new project we're working on, where we are trying to document things a lot better and keep things a lot more logical, but the train was running so fast on Bioshock that we just sort of...
early on we got the Andrew Ryan scene in, like we'd said before, and that was kind of like the keystone. We're going to put a lot of work into this, so this can't change. Everything that happens before or after that don't really involve a lot of departments working together to make a scene, those things are very malleable, and if you need to change audio logs to represent a story, if you need to add lines or take away lines, that's very doable. And I think for a while we even had text to speech.
We even did that, I remember for Infinite with Booker and Elizabeth and all their dialogue, and that really didn't work very well, because you'd have these dramatic scenes and it'd be like, Elizabeth, we need to go to Comstock, and it just...
Yeah.
At
some
it
point
was
it does
almost
fall
had no
apart,
value as far as I was concerned.
Atlas radioed on ahead. Says
One
you're
thing
looking
where
for an invite to the fisheries.
I'll wait till it
Nuts,
finishes.
I say. But if your heads up to the Warp Master's office and find old Peach on research camera, maybe I could manage an invite.
Ken has so much of, these games in his head, and you're sort of, you can keep it all straight, or try to, with all the different things and changes. But from the team perspective, Sean, I mean, because this is evolving and Ken's thinking in his head about how this all ties together, how does the team sort of keep up with, what the whole game is going to look like?
There's a lot of specifics that can change. For instance, Atlas used to have a southern drawl.
Right.
And then we recast to the Irish.
And we actually cast an actor, wrote the lines, did the whole thing, and realized that people hated that character and distrusted him from the first start. So had to rewrite him, recast him, redo everything.
Yeah. From a team perspective, you kind of get a sense on which things are going to be really volatile and that you probably want to push off till later, because if you work on it now, it might change. Larger themes don't tend to change too much, meaning we knew we were in Rapture, we knew we had Big Daddies, we knew we had Little Sisters, we knew we had Splicers, we knew what the arc of the story was about Jack coming into Rapture, and the specifics of this radiolog versus that radiolog didn't really affect anyone outside the audio team at that time, because we could still build the environment. We still knew what the environment was. We still knew what the animations were. There are areas you learn just by working in the same space for a while that this scene, I'm not touching this yet because I know that it's going to get changed a lot. I think these themes are pretty nailed down, so I'm going to focus the team on getting these things done.
I won't leave you twisting in the wind. We're gonna need to draw her out of hiding, but you're gonna have to trust me.
The audio logs were, a great part of the game, and something that if you're a true fan, I mean, people really go in and listen to those and piece that all together. But I imagine there's a lot of work that goes into deciding, well, this is better for an audio log versus game dialogue, and there's the act of sort of cutting back and sort of saying, we need to be clear about what the narrative is for the game. What was that process like? I mean, the audio logs, were there things you added at the end, or were those, ideas that you had for the game, but then said, hey, maybe we'd demote these a little bit and make them audio logs?
As Sean was saying, there's sort of a hierarchy of expense that you have to face, and so any ideas you have to get across, especially as you start playing the game, you realize, well, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. You have to figure out how you can introduce that idea. And generally, as the train is moving, you try to think of cheaper and cheaper ways to get those ideas across. It's less important, it goes to an audio log. If it's less important, it goes to a poster on the wall.
Well, there's also characters that you can bring in that have audio logs that aren't. Atlas, Tenenbaum, those are your big ones. You can bring in somebody to do a short, a few different audio logs. It's a character that some players may not even find, but
Right.
it adds a little bit of depth to Rapture.
And it also, usually each character generally is about a certain idea, and we don't just sort of come up with characters, we have an idea problem that we need to solve, and so let's introduce a character who's this guy, and he will be the guy who sort of shepherds you through that idea.
Julie, my dear, I am trying to run a business here. You want to spend time with my honeybees? Well, I'm going to have to start charging you for the pleasure. If I come out one more time and find you lolling out there amongst my hives, I'm grabbing my shotgun. As to your question, yes, my days in beekeeping school are a blur. But I do seem to remember something about that enzyme you keep blabbing on about.
So as you're going through the game and, writing things, rewriting things, were there things with the original Bioshock that you've always been surprised that more people didn't pick up on, or was there something that, a connection to a character you thought was really going to resonate with people, which, didn't? Anything like that?
No, it's the opposite. I was amazed, I don't know how you felt, but I was amazed how many people connected to the Would You Kindly stuff. Because I think it was when I wrote that speech, I don't think anybody on the team was like, oh my God, this is really this or that. And I don't think I really had any sense that people were going to connect to it. I think we ended up sort of over time finding more ways to support the notion throughout the game.
Yep.
And I don't think I really, until I heard Pat put together the revelation moment, where you had all the bits that Atlas had said to you in the past building up, and then there was a visual that went along with that. That's when I realized it was going to be a really powerful moment. But even so, I still did I think people were really going to connect to it or really even understand it? Because it's pretty out there. And that it was meta commentary too. I think that completely, I think I thought like, oh, it's kind of meta, cool, but people connected to it in a much bigger way.
Yeah, the choice to and everything, and also just being able to kind of roll back and think of all those other moments throughout the game, and it's a great revelation like that. They're few and far between in games where you sort of like, then you want to play it again, you're just like, oh wow, really, that does all make sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a team, we were definitely proud of what we had done, but up till that point, SWAT 4 was the biggest game that we worked on, and we had no expectation of that anybody would pick this up, or even like Bioshock cosplay. I remember the first cosplay I saw with the guy in the Big Daddy suit, and his little daughter was in the kitchen cabinet. I think that was the first one I saw. I was like, what? Whoa, people know this stuff? That's insane.
Yeah, people were building these outfits, and that only expanded with Infinite. I mean, that sort of went crazy with Infinite, where people were cosplaying Elizabeth and Luteces and Booker. It meant a lot to people, and I don't think that's something we ever saw coming, and we're deeply grateful for it, because it's one thing to make a game and get good reviews and stuff like that. It's another thing to have things that people are having their weddings themed around it, and their tattoos and naming their children after characters. You can't plan for that, and I think the only way that could happen is if you just make something that's something that you're deeply in love with and passionate about. I can say we were. It was something there was a lot of passion on the team about, but we didn't know people were gonna take away what they did.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Part of the challenge with that, though, is when people love fiction so much and they dive into every word written in every audio log and try and connect all the fiction, make sure it all makes sense. Are there any things from that game that you sort of look back and say, like, oh wow, like we didn't explain this and we should have, or things that fans have misinterpreted over the years?
There are things we think that we did that should have or shouldn't have been in the game. Like I was never a fan of having two endings, and I think
that's what the publisher was asking him to sort of have
that was the one thing that 2K, and they were very hands off. That was the one thing they insisted on, and it's not something I really thought was a good idea, because they're still limited, even though they're multiple. They're still limited, and so that was something that we ended up doing. One of the endings was far better than the other one. There's no. It's clear that I was much more interested in the happier ending with the little sisters than I was with the nuclear submarine ending.
I'm sure part of it was the idea that if this game is, if you're making a choice throughout it, I'm sure when some people are like, oh well, then it has to be a payoff, right?
Right. Except the game was really about lack
of
of choice. About there not being a choice. So that always struck me as a tension that was weird. But look, at the end of the day, they were putting up a lot of money, and so I can't really complain. They weren't dictatorial at all during the development. So that was the one thing. But that's a game that I wouldn't have put the boss battle in, the final boss battle. Like we seem to end up doing that over and over and over again. Every time we start a project, I'm like, I'm never going to do that again. We're never going to do that again, and we end up doing it.
Right.
We're not good at boss battles, and that you're fighting that guy, and look, this is the naked dude. It just doesn't work.
Totally makes sense.
But and it works really pretty well up till then, but then it doesn't. It just doesn't work. That boss battle's silly.
Yeah, it was an odd. It was kind of a weak part, and that was Fontaine was kind of good about the whole splicing thing up to that point. You kind of just lost it. But there was 2 points I was going to make there. They were talking about building Bioshock as an experience, is making making part of the world and all this. I've just not long finished Bioshock 2. And one big issue I had with that was it really felt disconnected from Bioshock 1, despite all the callbacks, new Atlas and Ryan, Fontaine and Ryan audio logs. It still felt really disconnected from the original game. Christ, that music there is loud. It still felt really disconnected from the original game, because there was no setup for Lamb. She was there the entire time. She was as big a thorn in the side as Fontaine. She gets dealt with, but she escapes, and it's a little nebulous in the time period, but it seems she escapes after she's imprisoned. After Ryan's death. Maybe pre-Fontaine's death, but post-Ryan's. She doesn't really care about Fontaine. She never actually ever acknowledges him in any audio tapes I found. But but she was as big a thorn in the side as Fontaine. She was at the spot on the spa posters, one of the brightest minds of Rapture, or the elite or something. Like, there was no nods to her at all. And then in Minerva's Den, it's the computer system that runs the entire city. Absolutely no nods to it whatsoever. It just feels like when they're making Bioshock 1, they were solely focused on Bioshock 1 and just came up with Bioshock 2 entirely afterwards, which ends up making it feel rather disconnected. On some level, I would have felt better if it was a cult that came to live in Rapture, and it, like, the dad that goes in to save his daughter, you ended up playing as him. I suppose that's in a way kind of rehashing the first game bit differently, but I know it would, given that there's absolutely no setup, no connection in the first game to them, despite them trying to build, world build and build this experience and all this, it really takes you out of it. It really hurts it. The other point I was making was they were saying people having Bioshock themed weddings. There's a guy I follow on Twitter. I think he had a Bioshock themed wedding. If not, he had at least Bioshock themed wedding art of him and his wife. Cartoon Loon is his name. I think he actually outright had Bioshock themed wedding, but it's been a couple years since I saw those Twitter posts. I barely remember it. Apologies, but yeah. So there's a fair few people out there. Because imagine he isn't the one they were thinking of.
Rapture is filled corner to corner with detail and history, and the cast of characters that occupy this world are no less dynamic. Every splicer, every level boss has a story. In many ways, these characters are a reflection of their environment, and their environment a reflection of their character.
Another thing that was weak about Bioshock 2 was the really lack of build up to the bosses. Like, you really got to see the artist well, but the two brothers that built the place, nah, not at all. They're meant to be the architects of Rapture, but
characters in Bioshock, there's so many that fans love, and there are many Wikia pages about them. One thing that I think a lot of fans may not realize is you were telling stories with these characters, a decade ago, and technology today, as we saw in a game like Infinite, you can do amazing things with facial expressions and storytelling. Conveying that emotion that you did 10 years ago with limited technology was challenging. How hard was it back in the day to sort of, convey story in engine?
We had such a small team that, we had to show Tenenbaum or Atlas. They were just splicer models, right?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
Tenenbaum was Ladysmith, which is there's a reason that she's in shadow behind glass, and it's not to be dramatic. It's because we couldn't afford to build another.
Really?
Yeah.
So just something simple like you couldn't afford to build.
We didn't have the we
didn't have
we had a few character models in the game. There's maybe 8 or 9 character models.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we're like, oh, we'll put her in silhouette behind a light, and people think it's noir.
And so much of it was driven by the voice performance, I feel like, too. Because, it all had to... It was like a radio play in many ways, still.
Yeah, we had some really good actors, and I was able to spend a lot of time with them. And the fact that I could write the stuff, direct it, and then rewrite in the room, and the fact that we had actors who were, for whatever reason, I wasn't even in the same room as them. I was on a speakerphone.
Right.
They were in a studio in New York or LA or something. I don't think I met any of them.
Really? None of the actors in Bioshock you ever met in person when you were making the game?
Maybe since, but at the time I hadn't met a single one of them. Except maybe a couple people, I played the Circus of Alice thing. Nate Wells played the Jack on the plane. A couple of people in the studio. It was community theater, in terms of the tech and the sort of time we had for it. But the actors were, we had some exceptional actors.
I will say, as doing animation on that game, that you can hide bad animation behind really good audio, and it makes the animation look better. We didn't have a tech animator. It was me. I'd never rigged characters before, and now I'm rigging characters, trying to figure out how, to get all of these characters out to the animation team. So we're very limited when it came to animation tools.
Yeah,
Since apologize to my animators.
No, but you did the big. I mean, for your first game that you rigged the Big Daddy, which is it's not an easy character to rig.
It was, we figured it out, but the tools that we had on Infinite were not the tools that we had on Bioshock. So we figured out what we could do and what we could do well, and tried to hide kind of, you know, put into the darkness the things that we knew we couldn't do very well. And having voice actors of that caliber that can bring those characters to life, you tend to fill in the blanks.
So tell me, friend, which one of the bitches sent you? The KGB wolf or the CIA jackal? Here's the news. Rapture isn't some sunken ship for you to plunder. And Andrew Ryan isn't a giddy socialite who can be slapped around by government muscle.
And you did get to revisit Rapture in the DLC for Infinite, and you know, with today's technology or technology from a few years ago, I'm sure it was liberating for you guys in some ways to be able to use that tech to bring the environment and also characters to life. What was that experience like for you guys to go back and sort of revisit Rapture?
It was liberating because we got to revisit it, but we also, I think when we started, thought we'd be able to go reuse some of the old assets, and they just didn't hold up anymore compared to the Infinite assets. So we basically had to rebuild, not just rebuild everything from scratch, we had to reimagine it from scratch because, you know, we had the ability to make it look grander and bigger, but still feel like exactly like Rapture. It is a different kind of, we're making a different kind of experience than Bioshock 1, so it was tricky to make it feel like it was the same kind of game. Because it wasn't, you know, the first one was sort of an action game, the second one was really a stealth game. You know, the Barrel at Sea Part 2 was really a stealth game, and you're really telling the story of Elizabeth throughout those things. Yeah. So it was a different lens, but it was also cool because it allowed me to make the whole story about Elizabeth. You know, to have her be central to the franchise from the very beginning, and she was always, you know, she became the heart of it to me, and to have her, it was really exciting for me to make her, you know, her heroism be something that set the events of Bioshock into motion, which eventually, you know, saves all the little sisters. That was really gratifying, a nice way to tie the whole thing up for me.
And you probably didn't have that idea 10 years ago, right? You had to retrofit it all?
I had no idea.
He has a letter that he's addressed to himself that's 10 years old. But, yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, for me, it was a nice way for me to say goodbye to Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, because, you know, those two worlds together, you know, you don't realize, or I don't think the audience realizes how much time you spend with these characters trying to get them out and polished and into the world. And it was a good opportunity, I think, as a game developer to kind of have that little coda at the end where you're like, okay, I get to, now I'm ready to move on to the next thing. I've had a nice, you know, break, like let's seal this off, and now I'm on to the next thing.
And it was like 12 years of our lives too. Between the very beginning of it, and it was a long time.
Well, I mean, so my daughter, who is 16 now, I did a lot of filming of her when she was 6 as a little sister. Oh, wow. And this was not mocap, it was just running around the office. And I'm like trying to be like, now trip over the thing and pretend you die. Or like, you know, like trying to like not like traumatize a 6-year-old. Yeah, pretend you're drinking something, and you know, and I never showed her the actual game until much later. But she, on BSI, I put her in a mocap suit, and actually used her for the little sister in Paris that's running after the balloon. So that was kind of for me like a nice
way to connect it all together. Were there any characters on the original game that you found hardest to write? I mean, you mentioned like, you know, recasting Atlas, things like that, but was there a character that was the most challenging for you, Ken?
Well, Atlas, because, you know, he was basically written completely twice. That was very, very tough, and I was very happy about the original character, and I thought I'd really done something great, and then you showed it to people, and they just hated it, and they didn't trust him, and if they didn't trust him, we were screwed. And so it was tough, because we, after having gone through all the recording, actually I had to let the actor go. It was no fault of his own, right? It was on us. He had invested in it, tell him that it wasn't going to happen, and rewrite it from scratch. That was hard, and that was tough. And then after I finished it, I had a debate with somebody on the team who felt the accent was really, really phony. And we had an English person on the team, and he felt the accent was really phony. So at the last minute, we basically ended up doing a focus test in Ireland.
Right.
To see if people bought the accent, because the actor playing Atlas was Irish, but he was from a different part of Ireland, so he was playing a different kind of Irish accent. Right. I don't think he was from Dublin, and Atlas sort of had a Dublin accent. And so at the last minute, I thought I was going to have to do it again.
Oh, wow.
And fortunately, the focus test came back, and people loved it.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence. I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive.
And a lot of the villains in the game felt like they were, very much tied to certain levels, and this was, you were still in an environment of levels with Bioshock, right? It wasn't just big open world. Did that all sort of get designed together? It's like, here's the best villain that's going to fit to this environment and this theme of, this area?
Some of them work better than others. I mean, I think obviously Steinman and especially Senator Cohen really, I think, dominate in terms of the level boss.
They are their levels.
They are the levels, and some of the characters didn't hold up as well, I don't think, on the writing side. The fun thing about the characters that work, like Simon, where he had all those little displays with the scissors and the tech, like that was stuff the art team came up with to support that character. And obviously Sandra Cohen, in that level, I had this idea for this character, and as this artist, and taking Andrew Ryan's thinking to the extreme, through a lens of art, was really fun. They were really, in a lot of ways, they're like more like Batman villains than they are like actual, real world villains. That they all have the Joker cares far more about the humor and the dark humor that he has, and the Riddler cares more about the riddles than he actually does about money.
Right.
The money, the crime is just afterthought.
Right.
It's the philosophy. And so these characters have a lot in common with, and there's probably a lot of inspiration taken from sort of characters like the Joker in terms of a guy like any of the characters in Bioshock, because they were really driven by their ideology, but their ideology is a mask for their sense of selves, right? This stuff is really, Cohen knows he's a hack, and he doesn't want to, he can't admit that to himself, so he has to wrap himself in all this nonsense, because the last thing he could ever do is look in the mirror and say, I'm not much of an artist.
No need to thank me for jamming the transmissions of those boors, Atlas and Ryan. Let them have their squabble. The artist, yes, the artist knows there is richer earth to till.
I really do like listening to this. It really is an interesting thing to see, and really does shed a light on the game and the work that went into it. Though it is also raising things for me to say. I did miss a bit because it was just like, I'm at the same time, I'm like, I don't want to listen to this. I want to play right now, but I also want to get it done. And just like, I had points, they were talking, like, one thought they were saying about the difficulty they had in development, and so they would lead to like hiding the models in the darkness and all this, and actually sometimes the challenge in developments and whatnot can actually aid the thing, like we saw there. Also, hiding things in darkness, great thing. Remember Alien 1? That was the guy in a suit, but it looked fantastic. He still looks fantastic, but it's just a guy in a suit. But because it's hidden darkness and shit constantly, you couldn't tell for shit. I do also the bit of the showed of Andrew Ryan there. Which one of the bitches sent you? I love the picture of him. I love that whole scene. It's brilliant. The other thing, the Elizabeth thing in Burial at Sea doesn't make sense to me, because she has to give the code to Atlas. But as far as I know, she only gives him Would You Kindly. But he knows the code Orange in Bioshock 1. And why wouldn't he know the code anyway? Because he was the guy who sent the kid off in the first place. Unless this is some weird double con he's playing where he knows the code but has to pretend he doesn't, and that doesn't make sense. So, it doesn't make sense to me, that bit, at all. So, yeah. I feel that was a bit of a weak point of it. I get why he did what he did and all that. He wanted to tie her into the original story and all this, but I feel that bit just doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't he have known the code? The guy didn't get to town before he died? As far as we knew, we were sent off a fair bit before he died, and presumably the work on us was done before we were sent off. So, it doesn't make sense.
Rapture is overflowing with memorable locations and set pieces. In developing a world that feels organic, lived in, and functional, Irrational managed to create a space that feels perfectly suited to the story and action that takes place in it, which begs a question: did the plot shape the location, or did the plot fit squarely into a world that was already established? Let's talk about some of the areas in Rapture, because it's an amazing place, but also it feels like there's certain areas that are very well designed, and that they have, you know, a very certain aesthetic, and the characters in there, it all kind of comes together. Ken, do you have a part of Rapture that resonates the most with you still to this day?
I think the opening is always going to be the most important to me, because it's we spent a lot of time there, and it was all for me as a challenge as a narrative guy is sort of how do we set up a very complex series of events and a very complex notion, and all this, you know, Andrew, with so much to tell, Big Daddies and Little Sisters and Andrew Ryan and the time period, and do that all without cutscenes. And especially, I think, the descent to Rapture, when you're in that, when you go into the bathysphere, you know, getting that right, getting everything right down to the, you know, the bathysphere, cresting the hill and seeing the city for the first time. Remember how much we worked on the timing of that, just getting that.
And it took us forever to figure out that we should just put the slide projector covering the window. Like, again, in hindsight, it seems like such an obvious choice, but we were really trying to figure out, like, how are we going to tell this story of Ryan and then reveal, so you can see the, you know, the city beyond the hill.
And also, we didn't have to show the whole transition going down the bottom of the ocean, because the whole screen was covered.
Spoiler alert.
I think that's the part that will always be near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was Kashmir. Yeah. That was one of the first...
The restaurant at the beginning.
Yeah, the restaurant at the beginning, because it was really like the first art box that we created that was Rapture. I mean, we created spaces before that weren't really hitting the Art Deco look. Scott Sinclair had just started, and he built that, designed and built that statue of the Atlas with the world on his shoulders that was in the middle of the room. And Mauricio had done some concept art for us of that space. And once we started putting everything together and getting it into Engine and actually walking around it and seeing those giant windows off to the side that just showed the seascape and really drove home the fact that you were underwater. It was the first time really all the elements started to come together.
And we actually we had built a bunch of stuff, and we actually stepped back and said, we have to just get one room right before we go any further, because we weren't getting it right. And so Mauricio did that concept drawing. We worked really hard on that statue, and that statue, I think, was the first object we really built in the game that was a Bioshock. So we just stayed in that room for like a month until we got it right.
And I think the original concept actually had a tram running through it, so it was like even more complicated, and that was one of those things we had to keep pulling back and pulling back to really focus on what the bare essence of that room was.
Were there parts of Rapture that you never were able to realize, that you sort of still missing? The zoo. People talked about Frolic, right?
That I was excited about. Not everybody was excited about the zoo, but I don't know why I was excited about the zoo, because it would have been a nightmare. We had another area that was prior to Arcadia that was more of a straight up agriculture, forest type of area.
Before we had the bathyspheres, we had a whole sort of subway transport system in Rapture, which we spent a lot of time thinking about, and then just realized that these little submersibles would be a much more realistic and much better solution.
You were going to be able to move between locations in that subway system?
Yeah, much like the bathyspheres, but they were much more integrated throughout the space, and we really want to support them. And we just realized it was not really relevant to what we were doing.
Were there certain locations or areas where you knew a certain narrative point, you know, needed to happen? Like you look at, you know, the reveal of sort of Atlas's true motivations. Like, was that like, oh, we've got to do it this level because it fits the story? Or was it more that you sort of like, you had the game laid out in a certain order and you just layered the story on top of it?
I think the big one I can think of is that you encounter Ryan in his sort of like, that he would live in an area of industry.
Okay.
You know, so he lives in this very industrial area because that's where he would feel most comfortable. And that we wanted his office, his lair, to sort of be not in some, you know, residential zone, but where he wants to wake up and smell the grease fires and, you know, and the machines and the smoke. That's in his lifeblood. Industry is his lifeblood.
But it also had to be very theatrical. Like if you look at it now, it doesn't look like an office. You kind of know it's an office because the story is telling you that. And we had some old technology that was laying around in the game that would control environment settings. So old system that we had would let you do high pressure, low pressure, medium pressure, and those would affect lighting and other like post-process things in the world. And that was a system that was cut, but because the code was in, we were always trying to figure out ways to use it. And one of the ways that we used it was in the Andrew Ryan sequence, because we didn't have a lot of narrative storytelling tools. We were basically switching the atmosphere to get all the lighting changes. So whenever a light changes in that scene, we're telling the game that the atmosphere is changing. So, and then the preset atmospheres come in and shine the spotlights on them or bring up the house lights when we need them to.
It was very, very early on. You could change the pressure in the areas, and that would change how explosions worked and all this stuff like that. And we just couldn't figure out how to make it gettable for the player. We couldn't make it feedback, but we still had all those. That moved a lot of levers in the game, so we still had the system. So we used it for the sort of theatrical cues of the, very theatrical cues of Ryan appearing, the lights going down where you are, and the lights coming up where he is, because the engine didn't have those tools by default.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
And there was a great sense of sort of artistic progression as you went through the game too, and that each level had its own sort of voice. Was that something that a lot of games as they move further in development, it's like, oh, we sort of ran out of time. We it's like we're just going to sort of repeat this and change the color palette. It felt like, for the team, it was very defined from early on that you wanted each sort of level, which they were levels back in the day, to feel distinct.
Yeah, we had sort of experimented with that back on System Shock 2, back when every Doom level looked pretty much like every other Doom level, because they were just working on the same set of assets. We decided with our very rudimentary tools in System Shock 2 that we would progress with color, and every deck would feel different from a color standpoint, even though most of that was lighting, or textures, nothing really more. But we had the tools to actually, sort of theme levels. I think a lot of this goes back to, I think my first memory was actually from when I was 1 year old at the Montreal World Expo.
Remember when you were 1?
Well, I remember being at something at this World's Fair, which I didn't realize, I think was in 1967, when I was 1 year old, a little over 1 year old.
Wow.
And I was on a theme park ride they had and I remember being at this thing where a big bat flies out of this sort of thing and comes up. I don't know why I was 1 year old was on this ride. I'm not sure, sort of a haunted housey kind of ride. And I remember loving it. And I think that stuck with me. So the notion of sort of theme parky themes and settings, and Disney World does a great job with Disney World. They theme areas. So themed areas are something that always resonated with me. And Bioshock sort of always has had this notion of feeling of theme in different areas, much more than the real world has. Like you walk from building to building, most of them you can't really tell them apart. You walk from walk from a floor of an office building to another floor. It's not going to look any different. But we always felt that was really important.
And it's also, if you look at SWAT 4, saw some early experiments with this, especially like the serial killer's house level in SWAT 4, which is probably one of the most dense levels that we ship. But you were trying to tell a specific story with that. And going straight into Bioshock and using the same exact engine that we're using, and we were very comfortable at that point with how the engine worked and how to art up these rooms, gave us a leg up when we sat down and really thought about what stories are we specifically trying to tell. And one of my favorite anecdotes from this time period is with Sander Cohen. I think it was Nate Wells and Stephen Alexander sat down one night, and they came up with a backstory for every dead body that you find in that space, and then they told that story with the props that they could. Even if it was just like this guy crawled 3 feet and then shot himself in the head because he was sad about something, they put those marks in, maybe put a picture next to the guy, and then he shot himself. So they really did their homework and tried to add the backstory for everything that you're going to find in that space.
I've got Atlas's goons hitting us non-stop and 2 dead mechanics just this week. We need to control costs. If I wanted to deal with amateurs, I would have stayed on dry land.
Kind of got distracted there. I was rather paranoid that I could hear noise from downstairs, but I think it was just noise in the background of that. I made only a single note there, and they were saying, moments has really stuck out to them, and I was thinking the opening for me and Ryan's send-off, that the both are pretty big things for me. The weakest part of the game for me is the Big Daddy thing, though that's because it makes little sense like when Jack becomes a big daddy, it makes little sense because the little sisters are acting like little girls, maybe off little girls when you saw them in Tenenbaum's place, and afterwards they leave Rapture and grow up and get married and everything. But they can only aid him if he becomes a big daddy and rips the shit out of his vocal cords. It doesn't make sense with what comes before and after. It feels like they were saying they started off with Ryan's, from sounds of it, Ryan's send off, and then built it up from there. It feels very much that they built that early on, and then built everything up else around it, and that doesn't really work. It ended up. I was saying it during when I was playing it. I've tried to like say something before online, and I would edit the sentence. Like I would decide to say something else, so I would edit the sentence, but I would end up half-assing it. So I ended up trying to say both things at once. Like it was like half of one sentence, half another. So it kind of feels like that there, and it does take away from the game. The fact there's no setup for Bioshock 2 ends up taking away heavily from that. But anyway.
To kill, excuse me, to harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the Bioshock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your Bioshock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of Bioshock's lasting legacy, of course, are the Little Sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. Everyone became a water cooler conversation about like, well, did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you
it
actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there were slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was.
Do you salt it? Do you
Yeah,
not salt
yeah.
it?
There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? It was
10
the
points.
choice was, do I want to fight the big daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs.
Right.
Then we start seeing that opportunity there of like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they, like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially, or you want to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys and go, do this. And I only had a few, the press, and this sort of happens over and over again. The games press worried a ton about it and wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose. That it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, you do sort of, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up that you. Well, we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing.
Gruesome. Yeah, right.
Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across. And I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not?
Right.
And people would tell us stories how like their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night.
Right.
And that's an interesting, that was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. Like this little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right? That has a voice actor connected to it who's an adult woman, and nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the curiosity of like, you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things as you go through the game? It's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were much more, should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's usually the way life is, right? It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, the two endings were, I don't know, like, I'm interested for narratively, like, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were given choice of once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about your slow descent into, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And so, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's two cutscenes with very tight time and economic
Or
constraints.
just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, in which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, positive or negative, because it is such a look. I think we really tried with Bioshock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It was really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to. And how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. How difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? This is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving Little Sisters. Although I have a few friends that I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I don't know if that was more, the game developer in them trying to see, what would
Right.
happen. But certainly for the most part, I think most people, which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart.
Right.
They kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the little sisters. So yeah, I'll say it. The needle sways towards the green there.
Time for bed, Mr. B. Hurry! Hurry, Mr. Bubbles!
Brilliant. I made a few points for this one. When the gaming media was concerned over the Little Sisters thing, due to how the gaming media acts now, it's probably because girl. There's been an article that came out recently of a guy condemning Resident Evil because Jill was ever in danger, apparently. I didn't bother reading the article. I saw enough to think the guy was an utter idiot, which isn't fair to him and whatnot, but let's be fair here. It's almost a requisite to be a games journalist now, to be an utter tosspot. So I don't feel too inclined to give them too much slack. Unfair or not. Also, the person sleeping on the couch because they harvested, the girlfriend banishing them to the couch. That girlfriend's a dickhead. I get emotional connection, but that's just stupid. And I agree that, they should have pushed harder on the penalties for harvesting. For not harvesting. That does actually make more sense and would have actually been added that extra level of difficulty. A lot of games don't make the good path that difficult. Like, in Human Revolution, it's easy enough to refrain from killing. Others in as far as I know, a non-killing endings. It still doesn't make not killing that difficult. I suppose like Deus Ex 1 made it that bit more difficult. Also, just the sea slug bit where they're harvested, it just looks like this little sister turns to smoke. Also, the ideology point is so goddamn true. And I was making a point, you could kind of... There's tons of people like that. It's presumably always been a case, but you can see it a lot right now in, for example, the gaming media. There was one guy, his girlfriend was like pro Gamergate or something, so they stalked him for like a third of a year because of it. Because his girlfriend committed wrongthink, they stalked him over it. And they did that because they felt justified by their ideology. My ideology says I am right. My ideology says these people are Satan. Thus I can do whatever to them. Slander them, stalk them, harass them. It's all gravy. It's all gravy, baby. Suddenly they turn into Austin Powers, just with an Irish accent. It's... I say this in Bioshock 2. I saw a quote on Twitter the other day. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. Ideas of people. I'm just out tabbing because I feel it's a little too out. It seems like it would have been heard, but I'm not too sure. People don't have ideas. Ideas of people. When people get an idea into their head, when people get an idea into their head, they start seeing everything through that idea's lens. And whatever doesn't fit that lens, they drop. So if you see if according to your ideology a particular group of people is El Diablo, you're not going to ever see that people, or with only great difficulty would you ever see those people in a positive light. No matter what they do, even if they do exactly what you want, they're wrong, they're evil, they're scum. And if you go far enough, they still deserve to die. Actually, I had someone say to my face that it was a Jehovah's Witness. Mum would have her in to chat. No interest in converting, but she liked to chat, and sometimes me and Jehovah's Witness would end up bickering. The conversations were actually kind of fun. Like, in one case, she says, living a Christian life is living a good life. And those who don't live a good life need to be removed because they harmed those living a good life. Which removed sounds like, you know. Unless you're talking about bringing back exile, but there's kind of Christians all over the place, so isn't really feasible unless you're sending them to fucking Rapture, which isn't feasible itself. So yeah, basically I had someone there because of her belief system, because of, well, it's more religious beliefs than ideology, but then there's a blurry line there. Sit there in front of me and happily tell me that I deserve to die for not believing what she believed, or even a similar enough derivative. She walked it back when we pointed it out to her, but I'm not sure if she truly walked it back or just like, oh shit, I shouldn't say that too soon, you know? You know, you have to pay enough to get to the higher rankings to learn the true story. Or the full story. So yeah. Basically the point is, due to someone's belief system, they happily sat in front of me and told me, because I don't share it, I deserve to die. When people, I've kind of lost my general train of thought here, but which is why I prefer writing, because I can go over things and whatnot. But basically the point was, when people with the ideology, they can like he was saying, they can justify things they would others see as evil. They aren't focusing in the moment. It's the ideology front and foremost, you know. And to have the same case there. Oh yeah, so saying that, you know, even if people agree with you, even if they go along with you, because they aren't part of your ideology, or they're part of a group that you declare as evil, even if they agree with you, even if they side with you, they're scum. For example, to make another example, feminism. Depending on the feminist you talk to, determines whether or not a guy can be a feminist. According to some, like my mom would have been one of them. She no longer is, because she's seen what a lot of them are like now, and it goes very much against what she believes. Some would, but anyway, some would say a guy can be a feminist. Others say he can be a feminist ally. He cannot be a feminist, but he's a henchman. While others say no. No. A guy is inherently an enemy. He cannot ever be a feminist ally. So, yeah. Even if the guys were, you know, perfectly agreeing with them, he's still, by virtue of, like, genetic sin, is inherently an enemy. Again, it depends on who you talk to. And depending on which circles you're in, one frame of mind will be more popular than another. It's really hard to get a general gist of what's actually believed. Like some spheres will seem more extreme than others, while others seem more mild. And if you spend enough time around one sphere than the other, the kind of perspective of it gets warped. Well, you know, the third perspective might end up seeming like the more typical perspective, while the first one I mentioned might seem the more extreme one. To be honest, it's starting to seem tilted like that, from what I've been seeing. I've seen ones that argue men can't even be raped. It's unwanted contact. I've had, at the Women's March, they celebrated a woman who tortured and murdered a man. So, and she was convicted and everything for it. Well, innocent people have been convicted. I don't believe this is one of those cases. I know anyone clicking into this isn't looking for my commentary here, but I feel like giving it anyway. Blame it on the sleep deprivation. I've been awake since like 3 yesterday, and it's 22 minutes past 7 now. I've been awake for over 24 hours. 28 hours-ish. So, I'm also in an odd mental state. I've been I struggle with a few issues. One that I've had difficulty explaining, but another one is it's ever since I read through Girls' Last Tour, I've been struggling with a sense of impending death. Just, I never, I don't like the concept of no longer existing. I'm an atheist, no afterlife, blah, blah, blah. I don't like that concept. So, it doesn't push me to believe in Anne because I wouldn't feel it's legitimate. If I don't believe, I don't believe, and I feel no reason to. My fear is not a reason to believe there is something. I need actual evidence of it, and I haven't seen any. So, basically, it's pushed me harder towards transhumanism and the like. I'm also quite taken by the idea of, the multiverse. Apparently, there is, as far as like Hawking's was concerned, there is alternate dimensions out there. No one's entirely sure what will be contained within them. They could be just the choices you didn't take. Going to McDonald's instead of Burger King, Taco Bell instead of Five Guys. Okay, I can't think of that without thinking of Gamergate, and primarily this one really nice piece of art of, the Gamergate chick mascot. Anyway, horniness aside, like I was saying in my recent recording of Blood, I'm just, I was running from zombies and they're like, brains. I was saying, I'm perfectly safe, I'm just horniness incarnate. Or horniness given form. But, yeah, it's basically the choices you didn't make. While another one is that it could be sister dimensions that are, nothing to do with ours. They could have different laws of physics and the like. And I'm taken by the idea that you could find one and there's, Lovecraftian abominations in there. I'm crossing all my conceivable fingers that, and I could actually cross my toes before, at least the pinky and the one above it. Not gonna try in case they get stuck. That, I know, I like the idea, one of them be favorable towards humans. Send me, you Eldritch waifu. If it's anything could happen in there, you never know. I much prefer the one someone else was tossing around before, infinite, dimensions, infinite possibility, because it becomes an inevitability as long as you keep working through them. Of course, you keep coming through an infinity of the same one, and potentially, but you never know where your, Lovecraftian waifu's hidden. You gotta search. You gotta fight for her, man. I want functional finger guns. Excelsior! Suddenly Stan Lee!
The illusion of choice is a thinly veiled dynamic that drives many single-player gaming experiences. And while many developers spend a lot of time trying to convince players that choice is real and authentic in their games, the truth more often is that choice is a superficial concept in gaming narrative. Bioshock confronted this idea head-on, searing into our minds a innocuous three-word phrase with an unforgettable new meaning. Would you kindly? Of course, one of the most memorable moments in the game is the "would you kindly" phrase and the reveal of how that's been motivating the player throughout the entire game. It's still, to me, one of the most classic kind of narrative moments in games in the past decade. What's interesting about that phrase is that it didn't always start like that. Can you tell us sort of about the evolution of sort of the the conditioning of the player? And there was once Excelsior was the phrase once.
Yeah, this is. I'm trying to recall some of this. So we had the idea, because we had the Andrew Ryan scene very early, and we knew sort of all the events that would happen. There were phrases before there was "would you kindly." The notion existed and what it meant and what it was, but we didn't actually have the phrase "would you kindly" until later, so we had a bunch of terms we threw in there. And like Excelsior was it for one point. That probably comes from my Stan Lee fanboyism.
Was that like so throughout the game? It would have been like Excelsior.
Just randomly
There are some things when you're making games you just sort of throw in as like, we need
Sounds
something.
cool
We need
Why don't
something.
you head over there, Excelsior?
And then it sits there for a year.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you kind of forget it's not good, right? And then until somebody comes along and says, "Dude,
seriously."
Yeah.
what's
Or you meant
Excelsior?"
it to be like a stub in. You never
Right.
meant it to actually gain traction, and then you're like, oh crap.
But that sense of some phrase or word being repeated throughout the game that you wouldn't really realize its meaning until later, that was there very early on.
Yes, yeah. And the fact that you would have something that seemed like a non-thing and then came back at you like a freight train later on was there from pretty early.
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run. Stop. Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
So that phrase evolved, but talk about that, the sort of meta-narrative of, being in a game, thinking that you have a sense of choice and making these decisions, but then obviously realizing that the player ultimately didn't have choice or was conditioned in a way that they would react to that. That was, sort of a new idea for a game. Where did that come from on your side, kind of? Was there sort of a deeper sort of, meaning behind it?
No, look, I think I was always interested in the concept, whether it's, Oedipus, not to get too pointy-headed here, but Oedipus sort of thinking he has, I'm going to leave, this city and go to another city because there's been this prophecy about me and I'm going to avoid my fate and I'm in complete control, and then finding out he's not in control at all, to the Manchurian Candidate, which is a story I love about, somebody who you find out is just a puppet, living a life of a man, and Fight Club. I always love those kind of stories about who am I and what is my agency in this world, because look, we struggle. I think everybody struggles that. How much we really have control over, and how much is our boss or parents or whatever telling us what to do. So that seemed like a natural thing for a story, and because it came from movies, that idea a lot, and plays. Yeah. I don't think it was very. There was a lot of. It hadn't been explored in games really, and games are particularly interesting because games.
You feel like you are interacting with choice,
and you're really being, most games, especially at the time, you're really just being railroaded down a corridor. It's very easy to underestimate gamers, and I think probably I did a little of my own underestimation there, that it would be a little too pointy-headed for people, but people seem to really engage, because it spoke to an experience they had, a struggle as a gamer they've always had, which is like, I want to control, but how much control do I really have in this game?
True. And Sean, it was also something that, was a great surprise when you played through the game. I'm sure, even for people on the team, did everyone know that when Ken was sort of doing it, or did it was revealed as people played through it?
I think, at some point the entire team knew. It wasn't, it was something that was talked about with a smaller group before, it was brought to the entire team. Early on, when you heard the idea and you just kind of clicks, right? You're like, okay, like I totally get this.
Did people get it? I seem to remember people looking at me like I was like a lunatic.
Maybe not the specifics, and maybe it's the Excelsior, or maybe you're talking about the Excelsior time, but the idea that you don't really have choice, and exactly like you said, you played through how many video games, and everybody's game is going to end the same way. You're going to kill these people, you're going to pass through these checkpoints, and you think you have a choice, but ultimately the only real choice is stop playing the game. So the idea that we're kind of like taking that on resonated. Now the actual, like, is it Excelsior, or is it the Latin phrase I forgot, or if it's would you kindly?
See, here's how I remember it, and I could be, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I can remember being so surprised by the outside reaction, because I remember the internal reaction being completely nobody connected or engaged to it. We worked on it.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of surprised by the outside reaction, because I kind of thought it was like, as I said, it's a bit academic, right? Yeah. And look, it also could be a function of...
We're playing it close to the vest.
I could be misremembering it, or it could also just be a function of nobody making the game had the experience of playing it through and getting to that moment.
That's what I mean, like it was revealed to them in advance of really playing it, so it wasn't that surprise.
Yeah, they had seen it in all its really half-assed, development stages
and
on the way.
out of order.
Yeah, out of order and all that.
And it's not really something you can play test over an afternoon, because it takes a little while to get to that point.
You need to lack the knowledge about what the game is to be able to sort of have that experience all the way through. I know you guys have talked about the idea of Atlas, the voice actor changing, and it was, I guess, very important that you nailed that actor, right? And you trusted that actor until there was sort of the Fontaine reveal and sort of understanding that.
Yes, trust was everything there, right? And so there was something about either the actor or the writing or the accent that just people immediately said, this guy's no good.
Right.
When the first Atlas we had, because you have to trust this guy, and if you don't, there's no trust. There's no punch in the gut. I think we've really focused on making him have personal stakes in the story as well. That he had his family trapped. Even, of course, it was all fiction, right? But he had skin in the game. He sort of spoke to you as a friend, and especially because the whole world was so hostile to you. I think it took a while to get that exactly right.
Listen, I've got a family. I need to get them out of here. But the splicers have cut me off from them. If you can reach them in Neptune's bounty, then maybe, just maybe. I know you must feel like the unluckiest man in the world right now, but you're the only hope I'll ever see my wife and child again.
Sean, what do you hope is the kind of lasting legacy of Bioshock? 10 years hence, a lot of things you guys were doing, have sort of become common now, right? With upgrades and moral choices in games and whatnot. But it was really pioneering work a decade ago. When you reflect on it, what do you hope people remember the game for sort of pushing forward?
For me, it's telling a story with the medium and how we used everything available to us to tell that story. We used the environment to set up the backstory of Rapture and really create a sense of space, which I think is vitally important to getting the players to trust that, to sit down and kind of like just be in the space and let these things happen. Even the radio logs, the rudimentary animation that we had at the time. I mean, we really sat down with the tools that we had and at our disposal and tried to tell a meaningful story. Maybe not meaningful, but something that would be memorable to people that they could take away and, like you said earlier, have that water cooler moment where they're excited enough to talk about it after they put the controller down. So for me, I think the legacy is that it was a story well told.
For me, it was a sense of place, being like the Rapture is a real thing, even though it's not. It's actually a very crude, from the time, a relatively crude bunch of polygons and texture maps. It's only, the original game is only in 720, I think. And I played a lot of it when we were testing it on a 14-inch, SD television. That it still felt like a sense of place in the music and the characters, that it's a real place. And I think that my memories of the Bioshock games is that I take away that Rapture's a real place and Elizabeth's a real person. Those are the two sort of big things that stick with me with those two games. And that's sort of what I'll always, carry forward with me in my life.
Bioshock is, it's a place, but as we saw with Infinite, I mean, it's an idea and it's a sort of a type of game. I think a lot of people say oh, this is a type of experience. When you think about, your career, where you guys want to go, I mean, that idea of those types of games, do you miss it now that you've sort of moved on to other things now, or do you feel like it's sort of, you've closed that chapter?
I mean, it's always a part of what you do. Like, System Shock 2 was a part of Bioshock. But it wasn't System Shock 2. It was you're growing past that and trying out new things. I think Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, and even going back to SWAP 4, those will always be a part of my experience as a game developer and what we're trying to do with the medium. So I don't think it's something that you just draw a line and say, we'll never return, because there's always lessons that you can learn and things that you bring with you to the next project that you're working on.
Yeah. I don't think the new game is going to, people are not going to be surprised that this game is new games from us. They're going to see a lot of what we had done before in terms of world building and aspects of storytelling. The goal is to sort of, move away from the you really have no choice kind of thing, and that's a very, 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 very hard problem, which we spent years working on. But we're building upon a foundation of stuff we've done before, just trying to go in a different direction with it. But it's always going to be part of our DNA.
City where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
Okay, folks, I actually was muted there. I'd muted the mic without realizing it. I made a point there that Bioshock 3 was accused of having a lot of fake choice in it, such as seen in. Fuck. I hate that I accidentally muted myself. Well, I muted myself intentionally, but then forgot to unmute. Um, this happens so much. Bioshock Infinite is accused heavily of having fake choice. An example of it is at the ballpark where you can throw a ball at the guy, gal, or announcer guy. It was interracial marriage and it's frowned upon in Flying Clan City. Um, and like whatever choice you make, you're stopped. The couple does give you a reward later on. I've always picked to throw the ball at the other guy, the announcer, but so I'm not sure if they always inherently give you a reward or if it was a remark to like they saw that what you were going to do. Um, they might give you a reward anyway because you created a disturbance and got them free. You know. There's also the lack of like a little sister substitute within it and whatnot, which I suppose kind of makes sense, but it does take away player choice in that regard. The choice that was in the previous games. I also feel it does differ heavily from the philosophies, the like philosophy aspect of the first game. The first game, Andrew Ryan was a flawed person. You see him grappling with his conscience. You see him powering ahead with it, thinking that if he doesn't, everything will fall apart. He's not entirely wrong with what he says. Even when he reappears in Bioshock 2, he isn't entirely wrong. He's still right on points. It's just he goes about it in a poor way, or whatever. While Lamb in Bioshock 2, you still see plenty of her philosophy. She used different audio tapes to her kid. Her arguments are a lot weaker. Her whole stance is a lot weaker. Andrew Ryan has valid points. She doesn't. Her arguments for her points are also incredibly weak. Like she makes an example of like saying the guy in Bioshock 1, he was more effective than his free willed counterparts, and that's just why people shouldn't have free will. Thing is, he was just effective when he was freed as when he had no free will, and his greatest acts came after he was freed than before. When he had no free will, he downed an airliner, killing countless people, and he proceeded to club to death his own father. And then hands the city of Rapture over to a con man who's going to bilk it for all he could, and then just leave everyone there to die. When he's freed, and all along the way, he saves the little sisters, but that was of his own volition. He wasn't ordered to do that. Both sides told them their perspective, but neither forced it. Which part of me wonders why Atlas didn't, but he was kind of playing a cool little wit, would you kindly. He was using it here and there, but he wasn't being too forceful with it. But when he's freed, he saves he finishes saving little sisters. He sacrifices his vocal cords. He becomes a partial Big Daddy. He strikes down Fontaine, and he brings the little little sisters to the surface. He gives them a family. He's with he's a father to them. His greatest acts come after he's freed, when he's no longer a slave, when he's a man. He was just as effective post-freeing as he was before. If not, you could argue he was more effective. When he was enslaved, he couldn't go down that elevator shaft to Fontaine's base. But when he was fully free, he could. Her arguments are cripplingly weak. She also makes an argument against, against free will. I can't fully remember it anymore. You'll see it when Bioshock 2 comes out next. But she makes an argument against free will. Decide you'll never be happy, never be angry again. See, you can't do it. That's why free will is bollocks, or something. And it's just an incredibly poor argument. Bioshock 3, if I find it, didn't really have much of a touchstone with the Bioshock series, so I wasn't really focusing on the philosophy or anything like that when I was first playing it. There was bits here and there to it, but it wasn't really focused on it as much as Bioshock 1 was. So from what I can little remember Bioshock 3, I'm planning on getting around to it soon. I'm iffy on when. I kind of want to install it right now. But with Um, I feel like it was less of a focus than in the first game. Even less in a focus than it was in the second game. It was much more estranged from it. And one of the great aspects of Bioshock 1 was that Andrew Ryan wasn't just a monster. He was flawed. He had points where he was right. You could see his emotional struggle with his guilt and conscience. Wham lacked that completely. She was a true believer and hypocritical to the core. Andrew Ryan did engage in hypocrisy. But he did it when things came to a head. He didn't do it from the get-go, as far as I know. While Wham did it as par for the course. She did it as par for the course. And she was a complete true believer. She would act contrary to her philosophy while completely believing she was embodying it. Andrew Ryan, at least at times, thought he was failing it. She never did. She never showed an ounce of empathy for others, despite proclaiming you must love the world and not show preferential treatment to your family, despite the fact she does exactly that. You must forget the self, but she remembers herself well enough to know that she dislikes the pain of childbirth, even being numbed, even taking painkiller for it. From the sounds of it, she went a step further. She was vague about it, but it's euphemistic about it. But, Andrew Ryan was a much more standout villain because of that, an antagonist because of that. And I feel, yet again, Bioshock 3 is kind of weaker in that regard from what little I can remember of it. It focused less on the philosophy and Comstock. Well, he was actually somewhat sympathetic, I suppose, from what I can remember. Him whole stealing Elizabeth thing was because he lost his own kid and he was, grieving father thing. You can only stretch that so far. I can't fully remember what I was getting at here, what I said initially. I think I covered the main points. It's pissing me off that I missed that so much. I did fiddle with the thing there, seeing if you could pause the recordings and not. You can't. It's only exiting out of them. It would have been nice because I could have directly commented on things, but c'est la vie. So anyway, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this series. I know you probably were more interested in just the developer commentary, but since I'm going to have to sit through the whole thing, I wanted to give my own 2 cents on it, my own opinion, my own perspective, because I feel I can add to what they're saying with some points I'm making, examples, and at the very least, if I'm sitting through it all, I want to get my own 2 cents in. I don't think I missed too much. I think it was just the Excelsior one. Maybe halfway through it, I paused it because I needed to. I was thinking of taking a drink, but then I wasn't sure if I'd muted it or not. But yes, if there's anything you'd like to say, please let me know in the comments below. I'm sure people may have something they want to say. I've said some kind of would inflammatory be the right word? I know it's kind of inflaming some people's anger. I can already hear the blood vessels popping from here, through time and space. It's been a year. It's probably about a year since I recorded this by the time it comes out. Actually, probably more. So, yeah. Feel free to tell me whatever comment you want to make, just include a timestamp. If you want to comment on the director's stuff, what I said, both, just include a timestamp for the particular point. Say if you're commenting on 5 different things, 5 different timestamps, please. Or just simply say, it's like they make 2 points here, one right after the other, just the one timestamp works. That's fine. Just give me a frame of reference. Because it's, it's going to be over a year. I've already forgotten a lot of what they've said. I wouldn't be able to comment on it. Even now, I would need to go re-listen to it and so I could respond to you. And in large part, I've forgotten what I've said. I've recorded the first part of this before I touched Bioshock 2. And I've finished that, and I'm starting on Blood now. Fresh supply. I've also gotten back to Doom 2, and I've recorded like 13, 15 episodes of it. I can't quite remember. But yeah, feel free to tell me whatever you want. I want to hear, just include a timestamp. I can see the feminist mark I made earlier. I'm blaming that on my lack of sleep. I might have been so loose with my tongue if I hadn't been awake for going on 29 hours. Now it's 29 hours. When I initially said that, it was probably maybe like 27, 28. So, yeah, and I've been kind of in a mood today. Been struggling with the fear of impending death. I've been struggling with since like mid-2019. And it's basically I've been struggling with for nigh on a year. Ever since I finished reading Girls' Last Tour. The ending of that really screwed with me noggin. Really messed with me. Fantastic thing, but it just screwed with my head. I highly recommend you give it a listen. Well, you can watch it or read it. I highly recommend it. Just make sure you're in the right headspace for it. Like the ending, it's hard. It's hard and it's depressing. I don't want to spoil it on anyone, but just how it goes down is rough. I was really hoping for a sudden happy ending, or it flukes out, something, I don't think it's a spoiler saying it has a rough ending, given it triggered a nigh on crippling fear of impending death, in a guy that's 24 going on 25. Well, I think I was 23 when no, I might have been 23 when it started. Or maybe I was 24 already. I can't. Yeah, actually, I might have been 24. Yeah. I'll be 25 later this year, 2020. So yeah, it's I think it's fair to say it was a rough ending. Given that, like, I'm not in my 80s fearing the Reaper just around the corner. No, I've probably got another like 60, 70 years in me. Or 50, 60 years in me before I have to worry about that. And like I've been saying, big fan of like transhumanism and being a full-body cyborg. I really hope I haven't cut myself off more than just that one bit at the end. Oh Christ! But anyway, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this, and I do hope you join me again soon. If there's anything you'd like to tell me, please let me know in the comment section below. Just include a timestamp, and I sincerely hope you've enjoyed. I know you probably weren't hoping for me commentary and developer commentary, my commentary on the developer commentary. But I wanted to add my 2 cents to it. And in some parts I do feel I've added to it. I certainly doubt I took too much away from it. But anyway, plus there's plenty of other videos if you just want to see the just the raw director thing. So, till next time. Love and peace, baby.